Hi, everyone. This is Miss Mary. We are on day 3 of Counting Coup, the story of Joseph Medicine Crow becoming a Crow chief on the reservation and beyond. We're on chapter 4, Stealing a Beef. When I was a little boy, I didn't realize I was living on a reservation. I was just having a good time. But looking back, I knew it was tough time for our Crow people. Our tribal population had dwindled down to fewer than 2,000, maybe as low as 1,800 people, according to the Bureau of Indian Affairs census. The reason for the low population was disease: diphtheria, tuberculosis, chickenpox, all kinds of childhood diseases had killed a large number of people. We were down to our lowest ebb. Even getting enough to eat was difficult in those days. The Crow people are meat eaters, and our primary source of meat had been the buffalo, but now the buffalo were gone. Since we don't eat horses and have no money to buy meat, we had to depend on wild game. But with so many hungry people hunting, there were hardly any wild game left on our reservation. No deer, no antelope, no elk, just rabbits and other small animals. In order to eat meat, then we had to butcher a cow on the sly, once that belonged to a white rancher. That was stealing, but we felt justified because the big cattlemen who grazed their beef on our reservation were paying us hardly anything, maybe 2 or 3 cents an acre to feed thousands of head of cattle. So we felt that since they were paying a fair price for our grass, we had the right to eat some of their beef. It wasn't easy to steal a beef. You had to be very careful. My grandfather, one star, was great at that. He'd take off by himself in the middle of the night, especially when there was no moon. Somehow he would come back with beef. I think he must have used a rope. He didn't dare shoot a gun because the cowboys watching the cattle would hear the sound and come running. The ranchers knew the Indians were stealing beef because occasionally they'd find a cowhide lying around. They didn't mind losing a few cows to the Indians because the price of cows was low at the time, maybe $25 a head. Besides, the Indians usually did the butchering at night. It was hard to catch us at it. One time, however, one of our neighbors did get caught. He was a one armed Crow Indian who lived in a shack across the river from us. His arm had been shot off in a fight with cavalry near Fort Custer many years before. One day, this old man went up to Wolf Mountain in daytime and killed a cow. A line rider for the Spear Brothers Cattle Company must have heard the shot. When he came over, he saw the old man skinning the cow with his one hand. He watched him cut open the inside of the cow and grab the liver. When it's still hot, the liver is very sweet like sugar. The old people who would eat it raw. So this old man cut off a piece and began eating it. The cowboy watched him eating the bloody, raw piece of liver, then shook his head in disgust and left. He must have been thinking that the poor old fellow was so hungry he was reduced to eating raw meat, not knowing that what my neighbor was eating was the tastiest part of the cow. Usually, a man would go alone to steal a beef, but sometimes two really close friends or relatives would do it together. Once you had a beef, you had to hide somehow, otherwise, word would get around. Other hungry people would ask for some, and it would all be gone in no time. My grandmother used to dry slabs of the meat. She would air the meat at night, and then early in the morning, she would put it away so magpies or ants couldn't get it. In time, the meat wouldn't be dried and could be saved to eat later. Sometimes we didn't have any meat at all. We then had to live on berries, cherries, and other foods that old folks gathered during the summer. I remember eating just bread and potatoes when times were tough. The Yellowtails were pretty good at growing a garden. Grandfather Yellowtail raised nice big potatoes. My grandmother would help with the gardening, and she raised chickens and turkeys. Most crows, especially the older people, didn't go in for raising chickens. It was too much work. They would do without eggs, but my grandmother was good at raising turkeys and chickens. So sometimes we had turkeys and chickens to eat, but often it was just biscuits and gravy. Although the yellowtails were pretty self-sufficient, they needed to buy some things at stores in lodge grass. Trying to communicate with the white clerks who could not speak Crow was often very difficult. One morning, my grandmother Lizzie and I went into the Stevenson trading post in Lodgegrass, where when Flat Dog, an old crow man, came in. He asked my grandmother how to say eggs in white man's language. I don't know, she told Flat Dog. At that point, the clerk in the store asked Flat Dog what he wanted. The flat dog looked around but could not see any eggs to point to. When the clerk again asked Flat Dog what he wanted, the old man took the clerk by the hand and led him to the middle of the store. Taking his blanket from around his shoulder, Flat Dog laid it on the floor and shaped it in a round nest form. And then he squatted on the blanket nest and cracked like a chicken. He then got up, pointed to the imaginary nest, and said, "Papoose." The clerk laughed, walked behind the counter, and brought Flat Dog some eggs. Flat Dog put his money on the counter and turned to leave. As he walked past my grandma and me, he said in Crow, "This white man is really dumb. I had to talk to him like a child." Chapter 5. A Life Outdoors. Although things were tough for old people, for us kids, life was good. We played lots of games and had no worries. In the wintertime, our favorite game was spinning tops on ice. We made the tops out of rocks, pointed rocks with the rounded tops. We get a top started and then use whips to keep it spinning around. We broke into teams of 2, maybe 4 boys. Each team would try to get its top to knock over the other team's top, like a couple of football players banging into each other. The top that fell over would lose. In the spring, when the ground was muddy, we had mud fights. We would get a willow or cherry branch, one that had a good swing to it. We'd put a fistful of mud on the end of the stick and fling it. We'd divide into teams, and those who got hit by a mud ball were out of the game. The game ended when all the boys on one team had been hit. We liked to have mud fights at night. Both sides would build fires. All boys would make mud balls and put them in the ashes. Red hot embers would stick to the mud balls, and when we threw them, they would fly like comets or missiles. Whenever one hit somebody, sparks would spray. Our name for this game was Shiba Ash, which means hunting with mud or fighting with mud. Another popular game for both boys and girls was shinny. It was something like field hockey with 2 teams using sticks to get a ball into the opposing team's goal. Sometimes we made baskets out of wire and tied them onto the end of the stick to play a game like the Iroquois game, lacrosse. We used a basket on the stick to sling the ball about the size of a softball made out of buckskin and stuffed with fur from a deer's tail. These were great balls. They bounced and would really go when you hit them. We'd fish too, especially in the spring when the water was high and catfish and bullheads would go up the Little Bighorn. In summertime, we would throw arrows. We didn't use bows. Our arrows were like spears with feathers on them, and they made them fly straight. Crow kids still do that today. One of our favorite summertime activities was swimming. Before we could go into the water, however, my old great grandmother, Bear, that stays by the side of the river, would say, "Be sure to give the water monster some food." Then she'd give us a little sack of food, and before we swam, I would throw a chunk or 2 of meat into the water. This pleased the water monsters, and it was all right to go swimming. We'd race each other across the river and up and down the stream. Then we would play the old stick game. We'd have 10 to 20 sticks and choose sides. Somebody would throw the sticks out into the river, usually at the bend where the water slowed up and was deep. Then we'd swim out there. You grab all the sticks you could find and then swim back and count them up. The team with the most sticks won. Yes, life was good for Indian kids in those days, but then fall would come and school. Chapter 6. The Baptist School. I will never forget my first day of school. I was 6 years old, and I ran the 4 miles that morning with Aunt Agnes Yellowtail, who was about 12. The Baptist Day School was a one-room building with one teacher who taught all the grades for about 25 to 30 Crow students. The teacher put me and 2 other children at the table built like a sandbox and let us play. Of course, I didn't know any of the rules. I didn't know we were not supposed to talk, so I started talking away, jabbering in Crow. I called over to my Aunt Agnes, who was on the other side of the room. The teacher came rushing over and said something to me in English, but I didn't know what she was saying. When she went back to teaching, I started talking again. The teacher came running over again, but this time she grabbed me and shook me quite severely, hard enough to scare me. I started crying, and as I was crying, she continued to shake me. The more she shook me, the more I cried. This went on for a while, the shaking and the crying. Finally, I got loose from her and ran around the desk with her right after me. She finally caught me, and then she shook me some more. We were now standing in the front of the class. As I stood there, I finally quit crying, but I started hiccuping. Every time I hiccuped, she'd look at me and say, "When you hiccup, say excuse me." At first, I didn't understand what she wanted. I finally got the message, but when I tried to say excuse me in English, I couldn't say it. She would insist I say excuse me. When I didn't, she would shake me some more, and I would cry some more. This went on forever, it seemed. For the rest of the day, I just sat real quiet at the table, feeling pretty bad. I hated that woman right from the start. When I was little, my great grandmother Bear, that stays by the side of the river, had said to me, "If you're not a good boy, I'll give you to the white people." That old lady instilled in me the idea that white people were to be feared, but they were dangerous and mean. And my experience with the school teacher proved to me that my grandmother was right. For a long time after that, I would just keep quiet, not doing anything the entire day at school. The teacher ignored me for the rest of the year. For 3 years, I stayed at the Baptist Mission School. That mean old teacher left and a new one came. Most of the teaching consisted of putting me at the blackboard drawing and copying ABCs, one, two, threes, and so forth. I did not learn much of anything at all. Racing. Chapter 7. School didn't improve much during the time, but summers got better and better. During the summer, we all rode horses. We spent a lot of time out in the hills catching colts and yearlings and breaking them. Sometimes, especially at night, we would slip out into the big cattle outfits and rope calves or steers and ride them. We also raced our horses. Girls raised great race horses. We'd race each other all summer on the straightaway benches, the areas of flat land out in the hills. Kids never gambled in the horse races, but the men did. They gambled their saddles, their horses, all their money, and anything they had. I remember my uncle Bob Yellowtail came without money to a big horse race on the opposite side of Lodge Grass. He pulled out his watch, a real fancy watch, put it in the pot, and lost it. I learned a lot about riding horses from my grandfather One Star, who raised all kinds of racehorses. He made a jockey out of me when I was only about 8. There was an important horse race at Crow Agency, and somebody had put up a live cow as a prize. The racetrack was a short one, about 5 to 600 yards long. About 30 good horses, mostly specially trained to race short distances, were entered in the race. My uncle Carson Yellowtail owned one of the fastest horses, named Colonel T. It was a thoroughbred. A man at Xavier owned a half brother of Colonel T. Another half brother was owned by someone in Black Lodge. The Crooked Arm Boys also had a half brother of Colonel T. They called Messenger Boy. They were all real fast, short distance racehorses. They always won the big races at Sheridan, Gillette, Miles City, and Billings. Anyhow, my grandfather One Star had this tall, long distance racehorse he named Glass Eye because it had one gray eye and one black eye. I think it was an English jumping horse. It was the biggest thoroughbred I had ever seen. One Star decided to run old Glass Eye in that big race. Glass Eye could easily run 2 miles, and he was hard to beat at that distance, but he had no chance in a short race like this one. As I stood there watching, Grandfather suddenly, "Get on him!" I was afraid, but I climbed on Glass Eye. "All right, let's go." Grandfather led me to the edge of the long line of horses so I would not be right in the thick of it. I was riding bareback. My short little legs were way up high on Glass Eye's ribs. "Grab some mane," Grandfather said. "Wrap your hands around the mane and hang on. Hold on to the reins with your right hand. Hold him tight." After I did that, Grandfather said, "Don't worry about whipping Glass Eye. He'll run by himself." We stood there a while, and suddenly, bang, someone fired a pistol. Off we went. Old Glass Eye took off, and I think my feet were flying straight out for a while, but I just closed my eyes and hung on tightly as I could. I was afraid to fall off. I couldn't pull him back. Couldn't do a thing. I opened one of my eyes a little bit and then I closed again. When I finally opened my eyes all that way, I saw Glass Eye was heading right for a gully, a big wide gully. Hard as I tried, I couldn't turn him one way or the other. I was sure I was going to die, but that old horse jumped and sailed clear across a deep gully. People didn't believe a horse could jump that far. Anyhow, I came in last. Old Glass Eye was just warming up when the race ended. That was my first experience riding a racehorse. When we got back to camp, somebody told my mother that I had been in the big race. She almost cried. From then on, I was Grandfather One Star's jockey. He had a small sorrel that was hard to beat at 2 miles. I rode that sorrel for several years and won every race I entered. Sometimes we would go clear to Buffalo, Wyoming, sometimes like 300 miles from the reservation for a horse race. I remember One Star buying me my first saddle. He came home one midnight carrying a large gunny sack. He opened it, out fell a brand new saddle. I sat on the saddle all night. Chapter 8. Ghosts. My grandparents instilled many fears in me. Once I confronted 3 of those fears, ghosts, white men, and Sioux, at one time. They killed me, or I thought they did, but I came back to life. Here's what happened. When I was about 10 years old, I started having trouble breathing through my nose. My grandparents thought that some object had gotten into my nostrils, so they took me to the Federal Indian Hospital at Crow Agency. That's when it all started. As I entered the hospital, a tall, stout nurse appeared. She was Sue, an enemy. She looked into my nostrils and took me to see another person I feared, a white man doctor. The white man put some sharp knives on a table and put something over my mouth and nose. It smelled terrible. Soon I was feeling numb all over. All I could move were my fingers. The sounds in the room started fading away. Yes, I thought to myself, now these 2 feared enemies were killing me. Then I was gone. When I woke up, I was in bed in a strange room all alone. It was nighttime and the hospital staff had turned off the lights. As I lay there, the thought came to me that third danger would come now. A ghost would appear. Crow people at that time believed a hospital was a place where people came to die. They also believed that ghosts of the dead remained in the hospital for a few days after they died. Now was the time for ghosts to come around. I pulled the covers over my head. Although I was terrified, I finally fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, there across the room was a ghost lying on a bed. He certainly looked like a ghost to me with his bluish white skin, his hooked nose, his long tangled white hair, and his white beard. His gaping mouth was wide open. The ghost had no teeth. I jumped out of my bed and ran into the long hallway, screaming, "Ghost! Ghost!" As I dashed for the door at the end of the hallway, I could hear heavy first footsteps behind me. They came closer and closer. Then the steps caught up with me, and I was lifted off the floor. It was my enemy, the big Sioux nurse. She grabbed me and dragged me back to my room. She pushed me in and held the door shut so I could not get out. When I finally calmed down, I edged back into bed and cautiously peeked at the ghost, who was sitting up in bed and vigorously eating his breakfast. After he finally finished eating, he looked at me with a watery blue eyes and said in Crow language, "Little boy, do not be afraid of me. I am just an old white man," and I took off again. If there was anything I feared worse than a ghost, it was a white man, especially one with long hair and a beard. After I returned to the room a second time, the white man tried again to reassure me that I was in no danger. "What is your name?" he asked in the Crow language. "Winterman," I replied, "but I am also called Joseph Medicine Crow." Then the white man asked, and still in Crow, "Are you Chief Medicine Crow's grandson?" I said yes. "I know him quite well," the ghost said. "I went with him on the warpath against the Sioux several times." Despite our harrowing introduction, the old white man and I became good roommates and later friends. He was Thomas H. LaForge, a man known among my people as a White Crow Indian. His Indian name was Horse Rider. As a young man, he had left his white family and married a Crow woman. When his wife died, he had gone to Alaska and became a whaler. Horse Rider told me many stories about the old days, about going on the warpath with my grandfather. I found some of his stories hard to believe, especially when he told me of seeing fish as big and long as our hospital wing. He was, of course, talking about the whales he had hunted in the Alaskan waters. but he was unable to explain himself clearly to me because there is no word for whale in the Crow language. Thomas LaForge had come back to the Crow people in his old age. He had come back sick, so he was taken to the hospital and put in my room while I was asleep. As it turned out, I had needed adenoids, an adenoids operation, but of course I did not know it at the time. Our paths crossed many times before he died. He always wanted to tell stories, but we children did not pay attention. Why listen to a white man tell stories when there were so many tribal storytellers around? That's the end for day 3. We'll start chapter 9 on day 4.